I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Old on Old. And this week we're going to be looking at a classic 80s comedy that launched a class of comedians film we'll never forget. I'm talking about none other than Caddyshack. So, if you guys are new to the series, what I do every single week is I break down a classic film that I've never seen before. I've seen big ones like Citizen Kane and Casablanca, but there's still some different sort of holes in my film knowledge that I want to sort of cover, and because I'm watching these for the first time, I talk about its historical context as to what made it a classic, as well as my first initial thoughts of a 2018 viewpoint of seeing a movie for the very first time, and sort of my thoughts on it and seeing if it still holds up. So the plot of Caddyshack is about a group of golfers, and it really just explores the relationship. There's the caddies, there's the owner, and then sort of all the golfers, all the patrons of the golf course, and shenanigans ensue essentially. But starting off with some of the historical context, this film is mostly known for launching a lot of comedians into sort of stardom. Three big ones that have really sort of sustained in the comedy lexicon, I guess you could say, is Bill Murray, who before this did some stuff on SNL, but this really launched him to stardom with the next year him doing Stripes, and then eventually Tootsie, and then Ghostbusters. So he became a megastar because of this movie. Then you have someone like Chevy Chase, who did some stuff on National Lampoons and a bit on SNL, but this really launched him because after this he got Vacation and Fletch. And then Rodney Dangerfield, who really did no movies before this. He was a stand-up comedian. That was what he was mostly known for. And not only did this sort of further his stand-up comedy career, but it also launched his movie career with him starring movies such as Back to School. So these guys all started in this sort of 80s classic comedy and then went on to make their own sort of 80s classic comedies. And this one is sort of look back at seeing and having this all-star cast of all these great comedians in early roles. I actually liken this movie to, say, Superbad, where in 2007 a lot of the actors in that movie hadn't done a lot of things. It really launched the careers of guys like Jonah Hill, Seth Rogen, Bill Hader, Michael Cera, Emma Stone. And in the same way, this launched the careers for a lot of this all-star cast. You have the Brian Doyle Murray, even Bill Murray's brother, who wrote the screenplay and sort of really launched off from here as well. And then this is also director Harold Ramis's debut feature. Harold Ramis, also known as a comedian, he's in the Ghostbusters, but he also directed Groundhog Day, another fantastic movie, one of my favorites of all time. But not only was this a launch pad, this also was really a model for the future modern day comedies that still sustain today. There was a lot of improv on this set. Bill Murray is sort of famously known for having really no lines in the movie at all. He was just sort of given a frame, sort of an outline of the scene, and then he was sort of told and had to figure out how to make the scene work, and he had sort of improvised funny moments on the spot, and just shows how great of a comedian he is, because really the production of this movie is very fascinating in the sense that the script was very loose. There was sort of events that happened, a slight sort of through line of the story, but mostly it was just letting these comedians do what they wanted and make funny scenarios and try to make as many funny scenes as possible. Even the scene between Chevy Chase and Bill Murray, they added in at the last minute because they realized, hey, these two funny comedians don't have a scene together. So just little things like that they wanted to add into, and a lot of people sort of really revere this movie. It's on all these top 10 lists of some of the classic movies of all time, and really mentioning the improv, I mentioned that it affects modern day comedies because movies like Anchorman and Bridesmaids really follow this format of there is a script. Something like Edgar Wright films, for example, more of his comedic style is very much down to the script, and there's not a lot of improv on the set. But more sort of American blockbuster comedies let these sort of actors go off the rails and do their own sort of scenarios because you get some really great nuggets with them. The problem with that, though, I find, is that the story becomes jumbled and mumbled, and they sort of put scenes in there because it's really funny, even though it doesn't necessarily sort of forward the plot in that sense, which is why in a movie like Edgar Wright's movies you can tell there's no improv because everything lines up so beautifully in that way. And then also in terms of the production, because this was the 80s and had these sort of outgoing figures. There was a lot of drugs on the set. They said, you know, after every day of production, they would rap, and it would just be sort of a drug-fueled sort of party afterwards. And they're sort of surprised they made the movie at all. It was kind of insane. You know, there's been a documentary, and then even a Netflix movie about sort of the National Lampoon journey, and this was produced by one of the National Lampoon members, Douglas Kenny, I believe was his name. So you have a lot of sort of history in terms of the birthplace. Really, some people think of the '80s comedy, and that's really shaped, you know, modern day comedies today. So it's very important to the modern day American comedy. And now transitioning over into my thoughts. Comedy is hard. I think it's very hard to do, and it's even harder to be a classic because a lot of comedy is very relevant. But starting from even my position of sort of commenting, or I guess you can say critiquing the movies or just giving my opinions on them, comedies is hard because it's like, if a comedy makes you laugh, oh, why did it make you laugh? Because it's funny. It's hard to understand sort of and explain why it made you laugh, aside from, say, the timing of the comedian or things that paid off. And especially a movie like this where there isn't a lot of payoff, or the beginning, the middle, the end sort of the joke really pays off in the one scene, I guess, aside from the gopher bit, but they sort of pay off in this one scene. There is not a lot of payoff in the scenes. You could almost watch them in clips on YouTube. So in that sense, it was very well done. But for this movie, I found that yes, comedy is hard to do, but I definitely saw the holes in this movie. Going into a lot of these classic movies, because a lot of them don't hold up, I was skeptical, and I wasn't necessarily thrilled by the entire movie. The big standout for me was Rodney Dangerfield. This was my first movie of his, and I definitely want to check out more of his movies, like Back to School. I thought he was really funny, and it was great to see his entire sort of journey, and just an incredible character, almost on a meta level, where he's commenting on these rich people and all their sort of bougie type atmospheres and all their sort of odd traditions, and he's sort of calling them out just to have a little bit of fun. I mean, even the end of the movie where he says, you know, all right, everyone's getting laid, you know, and that's like, it was a great way to end a movie. He was a big standout for me. But then you have some guys like Chevy Chase or Ted Knight where their bits didn't really land, and really their characters didn't do anything. And really, if they're not making you laugh, they sort of fall flat on their face in a lot of ways. Bill Murray is great, seeing him as a different Bill Murray than I've known. I've known him as sort of the sad, pathetic Bill Murray that we've seen in the modern day movies, things like Rushmore and whatnot. But now this movie is sort of even more of a different movie than sort of the narcissistic Bill Murray that we've seen, and sort of cocky Bill Murray that we see in Ghostbusters and Groundhog Day. It's a very sort of physical performance. The movie really ventures into farcical elements at certain times, and there's a lot of slapstick humor, which I appreciate because, you know, that's not a part of modern day comedies. But like I said, comedies are always hard. Something like, I look back and I see The Jerk, and I love The Jerk, but then something like this or Ghostbusters just doesn't click with me. You know, I think comedy is, in a sense, very generational in that way. I like Seth Rogen movies. I like Will Ferrell movies, because I sort of grew up with them. This is the brand of humor that I developed at a young age and have sort of latched onto and stuck onto. Similar to, I think, with music. People understand their genre and what they like when they're young, and then they stick through that. They don't really explore anything new. And I think this series has really allowed me to explore and try to figure out things I like, because this could have been a situation like The Jerk, where I love that movie, but unfortunately it was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I also had some problems with the female, the blonde there, where there was odd relationships where, like, she sort of disappears for the second half of the movie, but she's in it as a main sort of central figure for the beginning, and she just sort of like this object character. She doesn't do anything for the story. It's a very sort of odd character, maybe a little bit dated in terms of that 80s kind of style, but, you know, I gotta say I was a little disappointed by this movie. Unfortunately, this is not one of the great old movies. I understand, you know, some of the why people think this as one of the greatest comedies of all time, but like I said at the top of the show, comedies are hard and comedies are very relevant. I remember watching Logan Lucky last year, and they mentioned a Game of Thrones joke, and I thought, ugh, that's not going to last. It's hard to say relevant, and I understand that, and I think that it seems almost that they were sort of just stringing along scenes together, and that works in something like Anchorman, a movie I like, when the scenes are funny for me and I connect to the scenes. Then I don't worry about the story as much. But when I'm sort of bored and I want them to pick up a little more, even though it's in like an hour 34, it's a very short movie, I still want to go a little faster. It's a little dated. Now, I do golf about a couple times a year, so it's not that the sort of golf references in some places were over my head, but I think for a classic comedy, some people consider this one of the great sports comedies, but there's not that many great sports comedies, in my opinion. Much more better, great sort of sports movies. So I think if you're, I hold it to a different standard almost because so many people say great things about it, and maybe the hype was too big. Even still, I was going in a little bit skeptical because I had been let down by other 80s comedies, things like Ghostbusters. So I was a little skeptical going into it, and still, unfortunately, it let me down just because if it's hard, like I said, it's hard to talk about, but if the bits don't land for you, if it feels a little dated, it's hard for you to get into it. But like I said, the standout Rodney Dangerfield for sure, an excellent part, and I think that even though I didn't really like a lot of Chevy Chase's sort of bits, it's great to see sort of the uniqueness. He's very different than Bill Murray, who's very different than Rodney Dangerfield. You know, Rodney's doing this sort of big, sort of almost stand-up routine, sort of commenting on people. Bill's doing this very sort of small, or sort of silent, but sort of big, sort of physical performance. And then Chevy Chase is doing sort of the more quiet performance in that sense. And Ted Knight's being that sort of cliched, kind of over-the-top, angry owner in that way. So overall, a bit of a mixed bag, unfortunately. But, you know, if you're a big fan of Caddyshack, let me know in the comments down below. Let me know why you're such a big fan and what are some of the parts that you loved about it. Were you introduced by your dad, for example, that loved it when, you know, he was a teenager or whatnot? Let me know in the comments down below. Until then, I'm Connor Old, and until the next time, stay tuned.